So thanks for having me here. I think Bosch is a risk pro company, not a risk averse company. A good example is that I'm here for the second time. So they have taken a risk on inviting me over again. So the intent of the discussion is twofold. The first is to try and see that how individuals can infuse more creativity in what they do on a day-to-day basis. And the second imperative is to try and see that how firms such as yourself can be more innovative on whatever you choose to do at. And what I budget to talk about today is some of the insights which I've drawn from my own research and reading in the space of innovation management. To just put you across at the anchor, look at this collage up at the screen. What you see are some of the firms, some of the institutions which are pretty well known. And I want to bring home the important dimension of the word capability. What happens oftentimes is that most of our focus goes into the outcome of a firm. For example, when you talk about Apple, you seldom talk about Apple as a firm, and most of our attention goes on talking about Apple's products like the iPhone, iPad, whatever else you have. But if you look at some of these firms, and I'll say start with NASA. NASA has a capability. Regardless of the mission that NASA chooses to do, NASA has a capability of putting people into space, developing foolproof systems but for a few major errors, and try and see that what are the things that the firm can explore. Look at IDEO. IDEO is one of the foremost design firms in the world. Give them whatever you will, and here comes a product which has very high utility, usability, aesthetics, and technology functionality into it. Same is the case with an institution like IIM Ahmedabad. When we talk about institutions like these, we often attend to the outcome or the alumnus of these institutes, but seldom talk about what goes inside it. So my research largely at IIMB has been to try and see that what are the ingredients that makes a firm develop a capability to do anything. A case like McKinsey or a case like Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble has a capability of branding. You give them a commodity and they can turn around and brand the commodity that can survive for almost 100 years in more than 100 countries. So the first takeaway that I want you to think about is, instead of looking at the outcome measures of a firm, let us look at what goes inside the firm. And if I would really draw it further down, if it only works, this is how I look at a firm. Since I said that most of the attention goes on to the outcome of the firm, which could be in the shape of products, processes, customers, business models, et al., seldom we look inside the firm. And what my attempt here is to try over the next 15-20 minutes to try and bring home the point that capabilities are more firm-specific phenomena as compared to what is visible outside. And we can broadly categorize capabilities into these 6 building blocks. The founder entrepreneur of the firm, the leadership that the firm has, and don't mistake leadership as only the people who had cut the ribbon here. That's not leadership, or that's not the only leadership the firm has. I strongly believe and I maintain that leadership is something which can influence others. A leader is someone who can influence others. So the way you write an email, to the way you talk on the phone, the way you interact with your colleagues in the corridor, all of these are signals that you send on to people as to what is a good way to behave, period. That is leadership. And it brings me to this very famous quote, though I don't know the speaker, but I can't mince it. And the quote is that leading by setting example is not the best way to inspire someone. Leading by setting example is not the best way to inspire someone. It is in fact the only way. So regardless of whatever presentations you make or the slogans which you have on the company walls, I think it goes without saying that demonstration is the key step. So that is the leadership part. The processes. My research suggests that, and I'll come to that shortly, is the locus of innovation is most often than not the processes of the firm, or what I call as the routines of the firm, and not so much the people, let alone the leadership, and the culture. And outside the boundaries of the firm are the institutions that is located in, which is the formal institutions and the informal institutions. If in India, in a country like India, intellectual property rights are not respected, let alone protected, then we clearly have disincentives to go about product innovation. And little doubt then that we resort to business model innovations and process innovations. Similarly, how does environmental dimensions of scarcity of resources, dynamism in the environment, and munificence and complexity plays out a role, is what is the broad anchor. And what I want to do over the next 15 minutes or so is to leave you with certain counterintuitive ideas, not counterproductive, counterintuitive ideas. And my request to all of you would be that regardless of the routines that you are settling yourself into, it might be a good idea to experiment with some of these ideas. The first important takeaway that I think I should have for you, the first role of a leadership, and more so it comes with the foundation of the firm, is to creating a stretch between where the firm stands today and where it wants to be at. And these are the three quotes which I picked up from Indian companies, because we have been speaking so much about MNCs, mostly American MNCs, that we somehow assume that only they have the license to innovate, or only they can innovate. It somehow doesn't happen in our country. I think nothing can be farther from truth than that. Look at the statement made by Ratan Tata. By 2025, 25% of the world's population will experience Tata's commitment to improving the quality of life of customers and communities. Think of how many firms can actually make a claim that 25% of the world population by 25, which would mean about 2 billion people, will be touched by a company's products and services. Similarly, Biocon, Kiran Majumdar-Shaw. This was a quote she made in 1978. Kiran Majumdar-Shaw, Bangalore-based entrepreneur, was a brewer by profession. In 1978, a women brewer was not a very fancy proposition, isn't it? Even today, a women brewer is not a fancy proposition. The statement which she made was developing capital-intensive premium products through disruptive innovation process engineering that could deliver affordable price and make a difference to global healthcare. Somewhere sitting in a garage in Koramangala in 1978, she is talking about changing the global healthcare landscape, where she has no license to be doing any of that. And instead of resorting to reverse engineering driven chemical synthesis process, which is what most of the $29 billion Indian pharmaceutical industry is about, she took a different path, which is fermentation based development. She and her team developed the world's first insulin and the world's first statins, lovastatin, atorvastatin, based upon fermentation process. And she made the world's first fermentation process driven statin when US FDA had no guideline on how to go about it, because US FDA never thought it is possible. It's happening in our country by entrepreneurs. And the last thing is about Dr. Reddy's lab. This is a misquote. The late Dr. Anji Reddy, when he started his firm, the third in the sequence, started the firm called Dr. Reddy's Lab. It was in fact the first firm in the country to have a dedicated R&D setup for drug discovery in 1993. We got into product patents only in 2005 after we joined the TRIPS. Way back, he had the vision of getting into product R&D, though it met with some hiccups and failures, and I'll come to that, the hallmark of leadership when it comes to innovation. Moving on, another important dimension is how do you create innovation in firms which have reached to a certain level of maturity. When I was talking to firms, oftentimes they dismiss that some of these practices, large firms I mean to say, they often dismiss that some of these practices are best performed in startups or best performed in firms which are flush with resources. But look at Samsung. And I want you to look at the two statements which are made by the leadership team at Samsung right at the start. In 1980s, the objective of Samsung was to be Sony. In 2001, the objective of Samsung was to beat Sony. The role model of Samsung, as you know, Korea was ruled by Japan for many, many years. So they were really wanting to beat Japanese in the game of business. And the objective shifted from to be Sony to beat Sony. Today, if you compare the revenue, Samsung is at least 5 times larger than Sony when it comes to revenue. 5 times larger. What drives this company to this magnanimous height is a perpetual sense of crisis. This might be very counterintuitive to many of you, that how does crisis allow innovation? But I think increasingly the role of the leadership is to let people have a sense of crisis without letting them burn it out or burn out in the process of creating crisis. So leaders are the people who give them a stretch target, an impossible goal to make, at the same time provide the right kind of support that they don't fall back. A good example that allowed this company to be what it is this incident that happened in 1995. What happened was Samsung was not known for quality, and many of you might still quip that it might not be known for quality, but way back, quality was not their objective. Their objective was to learn new technologies. So what the head of Samsung did, that he called in all the leaders from across the world to a plant in Korea, South Korea, set 100,000 cordless phones, which were defective cordless phones, on a pile and burnt all of them. And I think that is the best way to demonstrate that we mean quality. I see, on the contrary, many organizations that want to promote a culture of quality cannot get tired putting banners all across the company campus. that we have focused on quality, quality comes first. But nothing goes away in demonstrating that 100,000 of your own products, without even going to the market, you burn all these products in front of your leadership team. Another thing that drives this company is, you look at these 5 firms, Intel, Sony, Nokia, and Apple. This company doesn't have any qualms about being a fast follower. Research says in technology industry, where the rate of change of technology and the unpredictability of technology is very high, you are better off being a second mover, or what we call as a fast follower. There is no reason that only a pioneer will survive. For example, you know what happened to Motorola, the company that invented the cell phone. Only recently they sold out the business to Lenovo, Chinese company, and I'll come to that shortly. So they always choose to hook on to a leader. But to that extent, when they hook on to a leader, they don't mince anything. They go all the way out, imitate the process, and many times you would realize that imitation is the first step to innovation. The challenge happens when you stay with imitation only. That is largely perhaps the case with the Indian IT services industry. That we are so merry-making in the process reverse engineering and imitating the processes that we just don't want to take the next leap. Another thing about this company is what I am directing your attention to is co-opetition. So whenever Samsung has to come up with a new product, the classic way in which large organizations, I don't know about Bosch, but the classic way in which large organizations work is that for a new product development, they identify the pieces of the work that will be done at 3 or 4 different units. But what Samsung does is that the entire product will be built simultaneously by 3 units, as if they are 3 different companies. End-to-end product will be developed by 3 different units simultaneously. Now for a normal mortal, this might sound a horrible waste of resources. Why do I replicate the resources? But the philosophy of these companies is that we replicate resources to develop a sense of competition. In the space of innovation and creativity, we call this thing as creative aberration. Creative aberration means creative resistance. So the hallmark of companies that are able to excel and shoot out from a trajectory is to create a sense of co-opetition, where you don't divide the work, and then when the final thing fails, you don't know whom to blame, but you allow them to compete constructively. And the last thing is owner-led transformation, which means that often people assume that for a firm to be innovative, it requires professional management. Not necessary. Because the challenge with professional management is that professional management might at times be risk averse, might at times not take the bold steps. And that's why if you look at the literature, you would realize quickly that some of the most innovative firms, including Cargill, for instance, or our favorite Richard Branson's Virgin, are privately held. Privately held do not hold themselves accountable to the immediate quarter-to-quarter pressures. Even Bosch is one of them, isn't it? So the hallmark of these firms is that they do not succumb to quarter-to-quarter pressure. And this takes me to one very interesting statement made by one Harvard Business School professor, and he said that when brands are made over years, right? When brands are made over years, why are they managed over quarters? Think about it. We have no obligation to turn around a firm in 70 days. In a quarter, we just have about 70 working days, right? If not less. So there is no obligation as such. Go to the next slide. And another case is Lexus. Now, another important aspect of how firms are able to break the status quo is by setting impossible goals. And I'll take your attention to this very interesting case of how Toyota came up with Lexus. Now, Toyota is not a very old company, certainly not as old as Bosch. It was called Toyota, and the company used to make looms, power looms, hand looms, water looms, etc. That was the core business of the company. But the World War II to Nagasaki, Hiroshima episode shook the foundation of this company, and there were massive sanctions that they could not import any technology from outside, at least the allies nations, they could not. They had to develop everything from a World War II destroyed country onto making one of the most successful auto companies the world has ever seen. When they were doing reasonably well in the economy segment, one of the general managers of Toyota went to the US, and he observed in the US market that there are BMWs and Audis and Mercs plying on the road, and he came back to his folks back in the country and suggested that why don't we make a car that beats BMW or an Audi. And the immediate response was that if we are an economy size segment player, why shouldn't we just make this as our territory instead of challenging the guys at the top? Let us utilize our resources to make this as an important territory. Let us sell more Corolla instead of trying to go in there. And he said, no, nothing doing. And what he gave were these very, very interesting challenges. I'll read the challenges for you. Since you come from the automobile industry, you will be able to appreciate. The first challenge was the top speed of the new car has to be 155 miles an hour, fuel efficiency of more than 22.5 miles per gallon, drag of 0.29, noise level of 58 decibels at 60 miles per hour, and the curb weight of 3,800 pounds. Any mechanical engineer would immediately say that a car cannot have a very high mileage and a very high top speed. A car cannot have a very, very high top speed and a very noise reduced operation, and that too at a very low weight. These are physical contradictions, and he didn't retract on any of these contradictions that were just given to the people. What the car came out was 5 decibels quieter, 120 pounds lighter, 17 miles per hour faster, 4 miles per gallon more, and $30,000 cheaper than a BMW 751i. The point what I am trying to make here to all of you is that, again, the role of leadership. The role of leadership is to give very impossible goals that at the first instance people will just dismiss, that these are impossible goals. But if you give them these impossible goals and provide the environment for these impossible goals to achieve, then only innovation is possible. The challenge with most firms happen is because leaders settle for mediocrity. Leaders settle for very medium goals. And if leaders settle for medium goals, then what is the incentive for the next in line to actually stretch out their neck? Impossible goals. And Lexus, as you know, has been one of the largest selling cars in the luxury segment. And to add to this, look at this whole philosophy of this company. Economy segment, the largest selling car in the economy segment is Corolla. One of the largest selling cars in the luxury segment is Lexus. And the largest selling car in the world in the space of hybrid is Prius. Now, if you look at these three markets, they are orthogonal markets. Economy, luxury, and hybrid. They are orthogonal markets. And a single car company has a leadership in three markets which are orthogonal. So much for market focus and remaining focus on a few things. Which means that if you set impossible goals, you can actually try and make leadership positions in markets which are mutually competing. The next example which I have for you is of Lenovo. Now, Lenovo is a Chinese company and today the largest computers company in the world. The history of this company is very curious. And that is where I move from the leadership role to the role of the managers. What Lenovo started with was just a distributor of IBM PCs or IBM machines in China. And Lenovo was originally called as Legend. Not Lenovo, it was called Legend. They changed an American or English name called Legend into a Chinese name called Lenovo because initially they thought that Legend would make us appear like a global company. But Lenovo eventually was chosen the name because Lenovo would make them truly be proud of a Chinese culture. They settled for that. And the first opportunity that the company identified was to make motherboards in Chinese language. The BIOS, the moment you enter, you have a BIOS screen, typically it's in English. They said, why can't we make the whole interface in Chinese language? From making the first BIOS in Chinese language, they ended up acquiring the entire PC business of IBM. And a 100-year-old brand called Think. For how much? $1.4 billion, that's all. And moving on from there, they not only acquired the entire PC business, they acquired the entire server business, and eventually, last 2 years back, they pocketed the Motorola's mobility business from Google. Chinese company. Now here what I am observing is that firms and the leadership in the firms and the line of managers that I am talking about have the ability of finding the loose bricks. Oftentimes, and I go back to the word which you have used called disruptive innovation. Disruptive innovation is not same as radical innovation. The meaning of that, often people gets confused between what is disruptive is same as radical. Not necessarily true. It's working now? Thank you. It's not necessarily true. Disruptive innovation should mean it should destroy something. Radical innovation does not mean it should destroy something. In fact, the word disruptive innovation was coined by Clayton Christensen in his 1997 book, Innovator's Dilemma, which was based on his PhD thesis at Harvard, where he studied firms how they disrupt. Lenovo disrupted the market. What did they look at? And all Chinese companies do that very well, is that they looked at a loose brick. When you break a wall, one way is to just bulldoze the wall, but you require a huge, massive power to be able to do that. Second is how thieves do it. They take the loosemost brick in the wall and they remove the brick and slowly they open it up. The loose brick was Chinese language. China was a big market, 1978, China got liberalized, MNCs were allowed to come in and they came in. Second thing is finding distressed assets. All the three assets, whether the PC business of IBM, the server business of IBM, and the Motorola business of mobility, all of them were in distress. So the idea of these innovative firms is to take assets which are undervalued to the firm, apply your own management philosophies and make these assets work. And the third dimension of this organization, and a very interesting dimension, is called protect and attack. This is a conundrum. Innovative companies somehow are able to manage the whole dimension of market share and margins. In the classic 101 of literature, you would always be told of either you are a cost leader or a differentiator, what Michael Porter propounded, or you are stuck in the middle. But increasingly, innovation is about trying to achieve the both. You keep your costs at bay, at the same time you charge very high premium in the marketplace. Samsung is a good example, and we call this as a paradox of Samsung. Another example, can you go to the next slide please? Ma'am? Yeah. Is Nintendo. And here I am trying to talk about how do you discover new markets. Nintendo was, in fact, the oldest of the companies in the space of video games. Just to give you a perspective, the size of Nintendo was smaller than the R&D budget of Microsoft. Which means that if Nintendo is trying to play out Microsoft and Sony separately also, they are talking about fighting it out with the 800-pound gorilla. Obviously, you cannot take these guys head on. So what Nintendo did is to look at non-consumers. The challenge with strategic management exercises and even strategy exercises in general is that we have a very clear notion of who the customer is, and all the competition fight to get some piece of the market. Whereas innovation, as many call, is to create a completely uncharted market. That's what Lenovo did. Bunch of 20-year-old guys sitting in a tower in Tokyo decided that who are the people who have grown out of playing video games. People don't play incessantly video games, so people who have grown out of playing video games. Some of those people identified were the people who are in teens, the people who are in a middle age, and the people who are old age. And they decided that let me make video games only for these people. All the video games should be made for people who do not play video games at all. Very difficult target. And they innovated the entire business model. The business model, which was meant for Sony, PlayStation, and Microsoft, was that they look at hardcore gamers and game developers. And the revenue stream is that all Sony and Microsoft systems are sold at a loss. Microsoft and Sony sell their hardware at a loss, not even break even, but they make all their profit from the games. That was the business model. They were pretty okay with that business model. What Nintendo did is to challenge that very business model. The first challenge was, instead of looking at hardcore gamers, they looked at casual gamers. Very casual gamers who just want to exercise while playing a game. I'm fine with that. I don't get time to jog, I just want to exercise. That's the first shift. The second shift is, instead of selling hardware at a loss and getting royalties from the developers, I sell hardware at a profit, and then games are developed by the developers, same as that in Microsoft, but very simple games. And everything else is same if you look at it. The whole dimension was that instead of having a high performance console, you look at a family console. Just to give you a perspective, if I connect 5 PlayStation video games in a series, that can allow me to do a simulation of a nuclear fission exercise that behaves like a supercomputer. That's how powerful these consoles are. Now take up a Microsoft in the firepower of a console was a foolhardy task. So what they looked at is the most ignored part, which is the joystick. So instead of putting their firepower on the console, they said that can I do something with joystick? I don't know which company gave the technology. Was it from Bosch motion sensor? I don't know. But the joystick motion sensor technology was a major breakthrough, and everybody followed the suit. So another takeaway that I want you to have is that if products are designed for the extreme users, the market follows. A neat example for you to ponder on is the baby food. The baby foods, the Cerelac, Nanpro, etc., baby foods were developed by NASA. Now NASA realized that when astronauts are going to the outer space, because of no gravity, the bone density goes down and they develop the chances of developing fractures. Now to circumvent this problem, they wanted to have some protein supplement. And the best way to have protein supplement would be to carry milk, which will get stale. Second best thing would be to have a solid powder. Now what are the market size that NASA had? 2 people. They created a product from scratch for a market which had only 2 people. Because at any point in time, there will be at max 2 people in the outer space in 70s. But today look at the market of baby food. Massive. Same was the case with Volvo. When the Volvo buses were designed, for the Nordic region, the idea of the Volvo bus should be that a wheelchair can go inside the bus. And that's why the door width are massive. Now, I don't see many wheelchairs in Volvo buses in Bangalore, but the whole philosophy that even a person with disability can access the bus led them to the notion of having very low floor clearance, very broad gates, and that was a massive hit in developing economies. What does it mean? When we design innovations, we often dismiss the outliers, saying that they are unimportant. Let us focus on the meat. In the attempt of focusing on the meat, your product becomes very mediocre. Whereas we just look at the extremes, that is when your product becomes excellent. Yet another example before I move to the next point is Star Movies. Star Movies had dictum from the government, the broadcasting authorities, that your movie should have subtitles so that people who are hearing impaired should be able to enjoy the movie. But what happened after putting the subtitles? The average consumption of movies skyrocketed because now the normal mortal can understand what the heck is the guy is saying in English. And we all started enjoying that. That is an example of designing at the extremes. The next example which I want to draw your attention to is Make My Trip versus Book My Show, which is the meaning of business models. At the very basic level, both Make My Trip and Book My Show are double-sided markets. A double-sided market means that your customers pay you the money and your suppliers also pay you the money. And what are they doing? They are selling perishable products. Make My Trip is selling you perishable product, which is a flight seat, which is perishable. Book My Show is selling a movie show ticket, which is again perishable. But one is extremely profitable, another is not. Look at Book My Show. Book My Show has two very different things that Make My Trip does not have. Book My Show doesn't have a cancellation policy. Point number two, in Make My Trip, till about recently, every time I buy a ticket, and observe this carefully, every time I buy a ticket on Make My Trip, the guy who's selling the ticket, which is the airline operator, has to subsidize my ticket sale and give a commission to Make My Trip. So Make My Trip earns the commission from that side. Whereas whenever I book a ticket on Book My Show, I pay 23 rupees to Book My Show. And the simple difference in who pays you the money and no cancellation has made this company enormously powerful and virtual monopoly. Book My Show is a virtual monopoly. Both are double-sided markets, both are marketplaces of exchange, but completely different assignments. Yet another example, can we move on, ma'am? Is Swiggy versus Tiny Owl. Tiny Owl was an early entrant in the industry that talks about home delivery or food delivery at home. Tiny Owl came much early and with massive investments. But the business model of Tiny Owl was what? I take an order at an apps or at a kiosk and I relay the order to the kitchen, and the kitchen's responsibility is to supply it back to the consumer. Whereas late entrant Swiggy, which is an extremely profitable firm now, Swiggy with this model, then instead of me just relaying the information what is required, why don't I deploy my own people to do the transfer? Single thing. I do the same thing, again a double-sided market, but I just have my own people deliver it. And with GPS, if you order a food with Swiggy, you would realize that Swiggy guys will deliver right at your doorstep, in the door front, without calling you up. That's the GPS, power of GPS. They'll never call you up. They'll just deliver it right. If you're not at home, that's a different thing. They'll deliver it right there. One addition has made the difference between a loss-making, and Tiny Owl is shut down, and a highly profitable firm. That is the element of business models. So all the great engineers that are sitting before me, and I'm a novice, though I'm an engineer, but I'm a novice in comparison, is that great products are not necessarily great engineered products. A good example is Betamax from Sony versus VHS from JVC Japan. Betamax was far superior than JVC, but it was proprietary product. VHS was open source. What happened to Betamax? Gone. VHS became the de facto model. So it is not about technology superiority. You as engineers, or maybe we as engineers, draw a lot of pride in making very sophisticated products, but customer may not need the sophistication of the product per se. Everything has to fit into some sort of a business model, and that is what these examples I'm trying to draw home. Great engineering is just a start, doesn't mean anything. I want to just leave you with this interesting idea about spiraling out model of capability creation. This is one of the chapters of my thesis. I studied Biocon over a 20-year period, right from the moment it started in 1978 as an enzymes maker. And it was very curious to see that how did a company transfer from enzymes, which was a highly commodity product, into making biosimilars. And some of the most significant biosimilars in the world meant for head and neck cancer and psoriasis and extremely sophisticated products have come from making enzymes into doing this. And what I realize is that these companies at some point in time in their journey have to take some very strong decisions. The first decision is technology leapfrogging. If you are late in an industry, that does not necessarily mean that you have to catch up to the successor or the predecessor or the leader. You don't have to do that. You can bypass. What Samsung did, Samsung never was in the memory business of hard drives because they knew that in hard drives, Samsung can never match Seagate. So what did they look at? Solid state devices. And today Samsung is the world's largest maker of SSDs. The SD RAM that goes into the machine, Samsung is a market. So they bypassed the technology leapfrog. Another dimension is forging distant ties. Engineers have the tendency of trying to do everything by themselves. That if he has done it, why can't I do it? Let me also do it. But these kind of competitiveness that we often exhibit as engineers is not taking the company that far. It's not good for the firm at large. So taking those distant ties is an important dimension. And the last thing which I want to draw your attention to is retiring the assets. In 2007, enzymes business, which was a core business of Biocon for many years, they sold it off. The idea here is that as a firm, you should know when to retire your assets, the legacy assets, and when to plow back the revenue that you go from those legacy assets into developing new capabilities. Another hallmark of very innovative firms is the ability to introduce variation. A comment in the passing for all of you is to think about this after the session is over. The very reason why humans have survived for so long, millions of years, is because our ability to mutate, right? Which means that within our genetic level, we have quasi-random variations. It's quasi-random, not completely random, it's quasi-random. That's the Charles Dawkins philosophy, is a quasi-random variation. Now some of these variations which are fit with the environment lead to evolution. Some of the variations which are not fit the environment leads to cancer. And as a result, the host, which is the body, dies. If the secret of human evolution is quasi-random variation, even the secret of successful companies is quasi-random variation. Which means that companies which are more innovative than otherwise are the firms that can introduce variation on an ongoing basis. Three ways in which firms have shown to introduce variation. The first is the T-shaped personalities. You might have heard about this concept, but it is still worth the iteration, is to hire the right kind of people that have a significant expertise in a certain domain, at the same time an appreciation of allied fields. Engineers are more I than T. They have a very good understanding of the domain per se, but they are awful when it comes to connecting the domains or drawing inspiration from other domains. We call this whole phenomena as the Medici effect or biomimicry as an instance. If you look at this shifting bell curve phenomena, and this is another important insight that I want the audience to have at an individual level, is if you look at the bell curve, what happens is that most firms fit themselves in the form of a bell curve, the way they hire talent. So you have very stipulated guidelines of what kind of people can get into your organization. They have to be an engineer from such and such university, etc., etc. And with every appraisal cycle, you try to shrink the variation of the bell curve. That is called mean centricity. So you prune the people who are the outliers very effectively, and you shrink the variation. But if there is a person who is lying at the extreme of the bell curve, and the extreme of the bell curve are the people who do not come to the meeting on time, they may miss their deadlines, but once in a while they come with a very wacky idea, but they don't fall with the norms of the firm, etc., etc. The normal tendency is to fire these guys. But what you need to realize is today's outlier can be tomorrow's mean. And if you only can retain those outliers in a certain number, in a critical number in your company, you are more prone to be able to mutate with changing time than having everyone in the company at a very high level of redundancy. And the last thing is letting a million flowers blossom. Now, what do you think happens in companies like Google, where there are so many bright people coming with so many ideas? Like in your company, I have been told that there is a program that looks into soliciting ideas at the grassroots level. How to select which idea to bet on, which idea not to bet on? What happens typically is that people submit their proposals to a selection committee, and the selection committee decides based upon their expertise which are the ideas they should pick up, and funds are allotted. Whereas what happens in the other firms which have shown to be very successful is that management committee doesn't get into the way. Which means that if you have a great idea, you never take the idea to your boss. Whom do you take the idea to? Your peers. If you can convince 5 of your peers that this idea is worth taking forward, and then 5 of you go to your boss, then your boss cannot dismiss the idea. And the whole notion is that if you cannot convince 5 of your own colleagues on your idea, how the heck will you convince your customer to pay for your idea? Which means the ideas have to bubble up, and that's the philosophy of letting a million flowers blossom. And the last thing would be, going on, is this dimension. Move on, please. Keep going. Keep going. Pause. At an individual level, finally, some traits that I want you to think about and develop. The first trait is latent inhibitions. What I mean by latent inhibitions is research has given enough and more concrete evidences that firms which have very creative individuals, these individuals have very unique practices. One practice is called latent inhibition. Latent inhibition means that the creative class, their inhibition levels are very low, which means that whatever they want to do, they'll do. Whatever they want to say, they'll say, and whatever they want to behave, they'll behave, as long as it is in the broad guidelines of ethics. The big mistake that management can do in firms which aspire to be innovative is not only giving the guidelines of if you go beyond this, you will get fired, and if you go beyond this, you will get fired, but whatever you do within these broad guidelines, you are fine. The moment you start defining that you have to actually be in these 2 guidelines for the first 2 months and then shift, and this is the speed that you need to take, you are killing the innovation of the person. That is called latent inhibition. The second thing about creative class is taking their hobbies very seriously. What happens as we grow as individuals is that our job takes an inordinate amount of time in our life, and we somehow assume that this is what the purpose of life is, and we draw a lot of inspiration from achievements at our job place. But what is coming out increasingly in the creativity research is that creative people just take job as one piece of their life, and hobbies are taken very, very seriously, and many times these hobbies give you the seed of inspiration and seed of creativity. Like Einstein, he was not a novice violin player, he was a very expert violin player, and he never left playing violin for many, many years because that allowed him to be a better physicist. The next thing is cultivating humor. Look at this quote from The Economist. Not all mind expanding substances are illegal. They are selling Economist as a magazine. In our workplace, and more so in MNC culture, I have seen this, I have had the privilege of interacting with many MNCs, we often mistake sincerity for seriousness. Isn't it? Which means that if you have to appear to be a serious person, you have to appear to be also very, very, sincere, you have to appear to be a serious person as well, but not necessary. To be sincere, you don't have to appear serious at all. Humor has shown to have very many impacts on increasing your creativity. And the last element is honing multiple affiliations. So I once interviewed Douglas Solomon, who happens to be the chief technology strategist at a design company called IDEO. And he used to work with Steve Wozniak at the Apple II project. And I asked him that when you're working with Apple, how do you know whom to hire? Did you hire creative people, or did you make your own people creative? What are the dominant style? And he said that we hired creative people to make our people creative. And the next question is that how do you know who is creative? What do you look in the resume, or what do you ask in an interview to ascertain if someone is creative? And he drew this diagram on the piece of paper. And he said that the only question that we ask to ascertain if someone is creative is to look at how many affiliations the person has. If a person has only one affiliation, which is your job, discounting your title, because these titles may have a meaning outside the firm at best. Discounting the title, if you have multiple affiliations, which means in the last 6 months or the last 1 year, these were the 10 things which you are busy doing, mutually exclusive things, it means that your ability to have different connections in your mind is far higher than someone who excels in one single dimension, which you do one single job. So that's the only thing that we look into the people, not expertise, but experience, which is wide. So I'll sum up the session with one last quote and then I'm done. The last quote is that in India, in our culture, Indian culture, we give a very high mileage to experience of a person. How many years of experience? But the experience is good indicative of somebody's capability only if the future is an indicative of past. Correct? Only if the future is an indicative of past. But the moment you talk of innovation, the nature of innovation means that the future is undetermined, unfathomable. If the future is no indication of past, it's not a good idea to bank on experience alone. Right? So with that, I'll sum up the session. So thank you for having me here.